Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Sorry for the little delay. So thank you for attending a second day of the ISSA Summit. Turn that down a little bit. As a member of the board, I want to thank you for attending, and I hope you're getting what you need out of the summit so far. So my name's Mike Greer, and I want to just give you a little bit about why I'm presenting. I love security. I've loved security for a long time, and virtualization is very near and dear to my heart, as well as cloud computing, private clouds, public clouds, all that kind of stuff. So just a little bit about myself. Basically, I like to help people, and the way I translate this into my professional life is try to keep people secure. So whether that's people, businesses, small business is one that is really kind of in need of security. So I always try and start with a little definition of cloud computing. So this is your standard Nist cloud computing definition, and this is really just to kind of table set and set expectations in terms of what we're talking about and what is cloud computing that has been defined by a standards body. So, and you probably all know this already, but this is what it is in terms of cloud computing. And we're going to talk a little bit about a couple different types of cloud computing today. So we're going to talk about private cloud, just very touch on public cloud very little bit, and then we're going to talk about hybrid cloud toward the end of the presentation. So luckily for me, there was a survey that was just released on Friday of the information security group out on LinkedIn, and it's got this information is compiled from over 1,000 cybersecurity professionals. So there's some pretty good data points here. And one of the big barriers still is security. So I've talked to numerous customers, and their big kind of fear is, if I move to the cloud, how is security going to work? I'm not in control anymore. How does that really work in terms of security in the cloud? So this is, by the way, this is all cloud computing. So this is public and private and all forms of cloud. So the big barrier still is security. How many people are actually using the cloud currently? Okay, great. That's what I figured. Which leads to this: 71% are using the cloud or plan to use the cloud. So it's here. A couple years ago it was, is this really gonna take off, this whole cloud thing? It seems pretty insecure. It seems pretty unknown. But we've made a lot of progress in the past 2 or 3 years in terms of the cloud, and people are excited. People are using it. There's a lot that is kind of sexy about it, and in terms of getting things off-prem and getting things, having your SLAs and all those types of things managed by a third party. So this is from the Cloud Security Alliance, and this is just a quick detail model on the deployment. So again, this talk is really going to focus on the private cloud deployment model. We're going to just talk a little bit about hybrid here toward the end. But I just wanted to put this up again as a frame of reference for what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. So we're not talking about community, we're just talking about private. So this is basically, what you've set up on premises as a private cloud, or what you're thinking about setting up, or maybe have already set up in a hosted third-party provider for cloud. So I'm going to go through these kind of quick, because I know we're a little bit behind on time. So I just wanted to talk real quick about private cloud versus infrastructure as a service, because there seems to be a fair bit of confusion, at least in customers that I've talked to about this. So private cloud, the way I view it, is basically virtualization plus process. So this is your existing VMware farm or Hyper-V farm that is on site at your data center. And the part that makes it private cloud is there's process wrapped around it, there's provisioning, there's all these things that, going back to the cloud definition, that makes it a quote-unquote private cloud. So there's also infrastructure as a service. So infrastructure as a service is really an offering that a public cloud provider will provide. So Amazon, Microsoft Windows Azure, for example. So this is where I'm actually carving out a piece of the cloud, and I have my own network range. I spin up my own virtual machines. And again, I'm basically managing those at the machine level. So I'm not at the hypervisor level for infrastructure as a service. That part is taken care of by the actual hosting provider. But I'm actually controlling the operating system. So, I need to patch that. I need to do all the security configuration on the actual operating system and everything above that, all the applications that would live on that operating system. The nice thing about infrastructure as a service is you pay as you go. So customers have come up with some really, ingenious ways of using this, where they'll have a SQL server, for example, but they really don't want to run it 24/7 because it's only in use for, let's say, 12 hours of the day. So then they're looking for, well, how do I automate actually turning that virtual machine off during the evening, so I'm not paying hourly for that service, and then spinning it back up before any of my users would need it. So there's some interesting things going on there. So private cloud versus on-premise versus hosted third party. So on-premise, again, it's a CapEx cost. So this is all your storage, all your networking, and your servers and everything that goes into supporting that. So your data center, your physical security around the data center, all the subject matter experts you need to actually design, deploy, and support the operations of a private cloud. And really, it's customers that already have a pretty good virtualization footprint, and then they have gone that extra mile for the private cloud piece, where they're automating provisioning and those types of things, and operations and monitoring to keep everything running as it should be. Now there's a host of cloud providers that are basically kind of infrastructure as a service, but then they offer that hypervisor level of management. So that is your storage to a certain extent, basically how you configure your hypervisor. So how you secure your hypervisor, what access to storage people have, what access to networks they have, and how those networks are configured, how they're secured. And again, and then this goes back to, in the costing model, this would be typically an OpEx cost versus a CapEx cost. So as customers are moving forward and you're looking at, I have an aging data center, do I really want to, spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to refresh my storage, refresh my servers, all my network gear? Do I want to go from 1 gig to 10 gig? All those types of things. That's a pretty large outlay of capital. Whereas, can I partner with a good hosting provider and have more of an OpEx cost as we go forward? So I don't have to, have millions of dollars up front, but rather I'm paying over time for this service. How many people are using hosted cloud providers for private cloud? Anybody? A couple people? Okay. How many people have what you would consider an on-premise private cloud? Okay, a lot more. Okay, great. So this is really what this presentation is geared toward. So I'm glad to see that. This is something really obvious, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with this audience. Perimeter security is not enough. This is again from that the information from last Friday that was released, that 68% say security is not the whole answer. So I really enjoyed Bill's keynote yesterday. It kind of got me pumped up. As security professionals, we don't get that kind of love that we require, that we're doing the right things, and just by everybody being here today and in the past 2 days, I would submit that you are doing the right thing. You're here, you're trying to advance your knowledge, maybe in some areas that it might not be that strong in. So it's just good. That's just so defense in depth. We've done this with for years and years with all our infrastructure, our networking, and switching and host, Windows host, Unix host, all those types of things. The one thing I do want to mention about defense in depth, and basically, the majority of the slide deck really kind of digs into defense in depth and how we really do need that in a private cloud environment. We can't just, we can't rely on the perimeter. We need to secure it in different levels, in different layers, so that we are as secure as we possibly can be. The one thing I would submit is physical security. So I had a conversation with somebody the other day that said, physical security is really not that relevant. And I would take the opposite view, that in a data center where with virtualization technology, where you can have hundreds of thousands of operating systems in a very small space, that physical security is more important than ever. So if someone were to get access to a data center or your cage in a data center, think of what the havoc that they could wreak versus with 100 servers versus maybe 40 that you might have had before, or 10 or 20. So just physical security, I wanted to call that out, that I do think that is very much something you need to keep in mind when you're talking about best practices with private cloud security. So this is kind of the meat of it. Security controls, we're going to talk about all these different pieces. And we will start with the hypervisor. So different types of flavors of hypervisors out there. You definitely harden them according to the vendor's guidance. So VMware's got guidance out there. Microsoft's got guidance out there. Take a look at these. There's some things in there that you might not think about that do need to be hardened. SSH is a big one that if you're not using it, you should turn it off. I've been in many VMware environments where it's just on, and I ask, why is this on? And there's not really a good answer. Maybe it was on for some monitoring or something at one point, but maybe it's only used once a month. If it's not used, it should be turned off. TPM, a lot of the newer Intel-based systems have TPM. Those should be used if at all possible. And then configuring the firewall on the actual, when I say host here, I'm actually talking about the hypervisor host. So that is your ESXi host or your Hyper-V host should definitely be enabled. X509 certificates, they do prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. I very, very rarely see people using X509 certificates the way that they should be used. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I can't count the number of times that I've been at a customer and we've logged into their vCenter and we've gotten the little, your certificate is not valid, and the ignore button is always clicked. So I see some smirks out there, so I'm sure that's happened before. And to be fair, certificates are their own set of challenges. As someone who's got a PKI background, I can relate to that, but there's tools out there that help kind of minimize that. But basically the bottom line is we need to trust. So we need to trust the server needs to trust us. We need to have basically mutual authentication. On the network side, something I see all the time when I'm doing assessments is that the private cloud team and the network team sometimes don't really work together as they should. So keep in mind that everything that the network team has been doing for years and years and years is really applicable to the private cloud space. So there, firewalls, everything, switching and VLANs and all those types of things, which I'll talk about, those are very applicable to the private cloud. Because the private cloud, from a networking perspective, has really, brought its A game in terms of what it can provide from what it used to be able to provide from a network perspective. I remember when I first started, working with virtualization, I thought, well, this would be great. I wish I had a router, like a virtual router, and people looked at me like, well, you can set up a Windows routing remote access machine. And I said, no, I don't want a Windows machine. I want like a device or what now is called an appliance that I could plug in and do routing within my virtual environment, and I didn't have to go out and touch any of the other networking gear. So that's here, that's been here, and it's only going to continue to get more more interesting with OpenStack and some of the other standards that are coming to bear. So for network, isolate virtual machines based on roles. So if you have, depending on your application, isolate your web servers from your database servers, for example. This is just really common stuff that I'm sure everybody knows. It's just sometimes when you get in a virtualized environment or private cloud environment, you just don't really think about that. It's just, if you think about 100 virtual machines running on one host and all the networking complexity and intricacies that can happen between those 100 machines and never go off that host, never touch the actual physical network, then it kind of makes you think that even if I have intrusion protection and everything on the physical network, that traffic may never see it get there. It's all going to be it could potentially all be on the host. So make sure your virtual switches are configured correctly. Disable promiscuous mode, forge transmits are some of the things to do just to make sure that we're not actually inviting people to sniff our traffic. Create DMZ networks where appropriate. So in the past, DMZ networks there was always something physical. There was an air gap there. Now whole architectures can be built in a private cloud environment. So you need to create DMZ networks within the virtual environment. And then VLAN tagging. VLANs are very prevalent out there. And for the most part, I've seen the tagging has been pretty good. But again, this is another piece, just to go back to the first bullet, is make sure that there is work with the network team, the physical network team, to ensure there's compatibility. Because sometimes it's not there. Sometimes the virtualization of the private cloud folks set this stuff up, and then they wonder why it can't talk to anything else, and because they never really talked to the physical network folks about how to make it compatible. Isolation. So this is really key. It's not just a flat. It doesn't have to be a flat network within a private cloud environment, and it shouldn't be a flat network. It should be just the same as maybe not the same, but similar to a physical network where you've got you've got rules, you've got firewalls, you're keeping traffic in its own compartment on the network. If there are operating systems or virtual machines that are under compliance, so PCI or HIPAA or anything like that, it's been a best practice to isolate those on networks, their own networks, and their own hosts if possible. So with private cloud, if it's truly a private cloud and there's dynamic distribution of resources, then those virtual machines can get moved by the cloud, by whatever, if it's VMware, Hyper-V, whatever it might be. So you might have an HR system that could get possibly homed on 10 different hosts, for example. Well, it might be a better idea to cut that down to 2 or 3. I mean, still provide high availability, but also reduce your footprint, a compliance footprint that you have to secure in a PCI approved manner or a HIPAA approved manner, for example. So just isolate those as much as you can. Endpoint is one that really a lot of people, I don't know if they forget about or it's just not important. But if you think about endpoint protection from a defense in depth perspective, endpoint protection is all those operating systems. So those 100 VMs that are running out there, are they really protected from an endpoint perspective? So is AB running? Is anti-malware running? And if it's in a virtual environment, so a lot of times a virtual environment is used for development and QA and those things that we might want to move to a physical environment at some point. How often do people spin up a sandbox, 20 machines in a virtual environment, private cloud that they use, the developers use, and, how often are those really patched? How often are those, is the AV updated? Is the anti-malware updated? Is it even running on those? So, I mean, in some environments, that is a huge, huge risk, that you just have these machines out there that are basically running unchecked. They're not patched. They're just a big risk, and they're not adequately isolated or segmented from the rest of the private cloud environment. So if they were to get infected, or they could basically get into your whole environment. So that's another thing to really think about. The other thing about endpoint protection in a virtual environment is there are solutions in place that will scan from a hypervisor base. So instead of having 100 machines, running antivirus scan at 4 o'clock in the morning, and basically crushing the system, you can have the scan take place at the hypervisor level, which just goes out and touches each machine. It's much more efficient, and it's much less taxing on the environment. So I won't ask who's running, but anyway, that's a good thing to think about. Storage is another one which I get a lot of heat for, because storage security is a thing. People don't like to admit it, or just data destruction is a huge one. Not so much in your on-prem private cloud environment, but if you're in a hosting situation, how do you ensure that your data is deleted, securely deleted? And it's not as easy as it might sound. So there are there are tools out there to do this, but it's not as easy as just saying delete and delete from disk. It's still out there and can be accessed. So secure data destruction is important. And that's also important, especially for anything that requires compliance in your private cloud environment, is to make sure that that HR machine that was a 2000 machine or 2003 machine and has now been upgraded 2008. Make sure that all that HR sensitive data has been deleted when that 2003 VM has been deleted. So make sure that data has been destroyed. Fiber channel is pretty good as long as it's zoned appropriately. And the only reason I bring this up is because I've seen it done the wrong way in several instances where the hosts have access to the storage, but then there's also some other machines out there, physical machines, that haven't been zoned appropriately. So they might actually have access to a VHD or a VMDK that's sitting out there on the SAN that only certain virtual machines should have access to. So just something to keep in mind. iSCSI is really kind of the big one that I see really more, is because it's a low cost. So a lot of people set up iSCSI because it's not nearly as expensive as Fiber Channel, and this is more in the small to medium-sized business. I know the enterprise uses Fiber Channel for the most part. The iSCSI piece is, a lot of it comes down to the network. It should be segmented. It should, if at all possible, it should not be on the same physical switches as your user data. It should be isolated from that perspective. If it can't be put on its own physical switch network, it should have VLANs at the minimum, so that there's no commingling of traffic in terms of iSCSI and user data. And then definitely recommend CHAP authentication, and between your iSCSI initiator or your host and your storage. Mutual authentication, if that's possible, if your SAN or your NAS supports that, so that your NAS and your host can mutually authenticate to make sure that they know who they are talking to. And this can be a little bit tricky to set up, so I would definitely, if you're not familiar with it, set it up as in a test environment if at all possible. Okay, authentication and authorization. This one really, it comes down to how your environment is set up. Most, VMware and Microsoft both integrate with Active Directory. As we've known for years, it's always better to use groups than users to assign access and authentication rights. So set up your groups in Active Directory for people who need access to machines, specific machines. So if there's an HR group, put those folks in the HR group. And the other thing is, make sure that even if at the admin level, I see this a lot from the compliance standpoint, just because you're the admin of your private cloud doesn't mean that you should have access to an HR machine, for example. You shouldn't be able to log into that, right? Because you're not in HR and there's sensitive information on that virtual machine. So, that's a bigger discussion about, who has rights to what and hopefully that's something that's put together pretty well in your organization. You can just access or look at the access policy and just make your private cloud piece match that. But again, that's if you have a rogue administrator, for example, just think of what kind of damage they could do in terms of, you know, PII or PHI information. Another thing is console sessions. So if you're getting into virtual machines from consoles, really limit that to 1 or 2, just so you don't have consoles being opened by, you know, 5 or 10 people that you don't know about. It's just, these are just simple things just to make, you know, to help lower the risk to the environment. Virtual machine, VM sprawl is huge. How many people feel like that VMs can just be, you know, created and there's not a good mechanism to control them? Everybody? Okay, a couple people. So tools are great. Process is essential. I love process. I love efficiency. Those are just kind of my things that I love. And you know, when you put a private cloud together and it's easy. I can go to a web page and I can provision a VM and, you know, this is great. And oh, I need another one. I'm going to get another one out there. And you know, Charlie needs one too, so he's going to get one. And all of a sudden you have all these VMs out there, which goes back to the endpoint protection piece of actually making sure they're all secure, which may not actually be in place. But it's just the sprawl. So there's this risk that of, you know, unknown machine sprawl, unless you have a really good handle on managing all that. Harden the guest OS. So just because, you know, we've looked at the network, we've looked at the hypervisor, make sure the guest OS is hardened as well. So there's great, you know, Windows, Linux, Unix, everybody's got a hardening guide. Make sure it's hardened to the appropriate level. You know, we do need to do business, so it can't be 100% secure, but there's middle ground there that can be met. Host firewalls, all those things. Resource isolation. So this is one where it's one of those aha moments when it happens, but sometimes it's not planned appropriately. So when you have things like the development, you know, the dev environment, the QA environment, those things, you know, compartmentalize those within your private cloud environment. So if I call it a rabid machine here, but you know, if something spins completely out of control, that it can't consume, you know, CPU and memory and disk resources to the point where it's adversely affecting other machines in the private cloud. So, you know, production machines, just keep everything isolated is I guess the bottom line or the takeaway here, because even though, you know, hypervisors and private clouds are created to deal with that resource contention, it can definitely slow things down, and you can have some adverse effects from not doing your resource isolation. Okay, so that is, for the most part, that is the private cloud piece. So does anybody have questions on any of the private cloud stuff? Okay, so I put everybody to sleep. So hybrid cloud is really interesting because, again, this is from that same survey from Information Security LinkedIn group. Is hybrid. Hybrid is huge. Hybrid is this thing where people are just like, how do I do this? You know, how do I get from you know, my private cloud or my virtualization environment? How do I get, you know, things moved off-site, things moved to a data center, hybrid cloud? How does this work? So as you can see, 71% of people are, you know, what was the question? What cloud deployment method or model is your organization using? So currently using 71% of organizations are using hybrid cloud. So I look at that as the bridge. I see a lot of customers moving that way, especially, as I said before, if you have somewhat of an aging data center and you know, those CapEx dollars are a lot harder to justify these days. You know, maybe look at an OpEx option of moving things over to either a hosted private cloud or the public cloud, you know, infrastructure as a service. Those are all things that are in play. And what I see a lot of customers doing is doing pilots. So So I have a lot of virtualization on site, and that might, whatever flavor that is, I want to kick the tires on this this cloud thing. So set up a hybrid cloud. Integration can be somewhat challenging. There's I do a lot of work with Azure specifically, and there's some requirements there. You need to set up some things in the cloud. You need to get your authentication, your federation set up. But after that, it's really not that difficult to move, let's say, a pilot group of a couple, 6 servers, something like that, into the cloud. So this is a great. So right now, Windows Server 2003, end of life in July. This is a great option if the workload is the right type of workload. Is if you're going to move, you need to get off this aging operating system that's not supported anymore. Hey, maybe I'll just spin up a Windows 2012 server in the cloud and see how that works, and move that workload over. So some customers are using that as a way to kick the tires on the hybrid cloud piece. So any questions on the hybrid cloud stuff? Sir?
Give me a good definition of what a hybrid cloud is.
Great question. So hybrid cloud is basically, part of it's a connection between your on-premise infrastructure, and it could be infrastructure as a service. It could be another hosted private cloud. So basically, there's a VPN that's in play, so that basically your data center is extended to either an infrastructure as a service environment or another private cloud hosting environment. So there's some, and this is really getting interesting, because at least on the Azure side, so there's a VPN option, a site-to-site VPN option. There's also what's called ExpressRoute, which is something that's really gaining steam, where you can, from your data center, depending on your ISP, you can have a private route or a private path to an Azure data center. So your data will pass along the backbone of level 3 or whoever your provider is to an Azure data center, and will never touch the internet. So that's higher availability, lower latency, those types of things. It's not cheap, don't get me wrong, and it's not really widely available here in Columbus yet, but every week there's more providers that are out there. So, and I'm sure Amazon is doing some of the same types of stuff just to make it easier to expand your data center to the cloud from a hybrid perspective. It's a great question. Any other questions? Any questions on anything? I went through this really fast. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to go back to the private cloud.
Yeah.
What's your feeling on the risk of vulnerabilities within the hypervisor? We've seen OpenStack vulnerabilities, VMware, Zen. They're using third-party software that has vulnerabilities in them. You talked about hardening that can help mitigate it, but what's some of the risk there?
Yeah, so the question is, the hypervisors are really under attack. And that just goes to, part of the cost of having the private cloud on site is having the subject matter experts, having the monitoring in place to look at things like that, having, I know it's a bit of a stretch, but people like Daryl from yesterday that are actually going out and researching things and seeing what's up and coming in terms of threats to the hypervisor. But, it's a huge target, because if you think about it, the hypervisor is the lifeblood of everything that is running on top of it. So if you're able to compromise the hypervisor, then you have access to the virtual machines, the networking, the storage, just really the whole ball of wax. So I would say just make sure you're staying up to speed. Somebody is staying up to speed. The private cloud providers, they most of those have folks that are dedicated to keeping up to speed on those things and patching as appropriate. Patching is another thing, patching your hypervisors and all that type of stuff. So those are really, I don't know if that answered your question. Kind of, okay. Anybody else? Okay, I just have one last shameless plug. I just recently published a book in the latter part of last year. So a lot of things I talk about, if you're a VMware shop and you want some more depth on that, this book has it. It was basically written to secure a VMware environment. And although it doesn't deal much with vCloud, it does deal with the core vSphere infrastructure. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. And it was really interesting writing a book. If anybody's thinking about writing a book, I'd be happy to give you some horror, good, bad, and ugly about writing a book. So that's out there if you're interested. Also, I'm available if you have any questions after the presentation. I'd be happy to chat with you. So if there's no more questions. Okay, thank you very much.